Salutations, respected viewers. I am George from Ireland. I'm on 36 Onslow Square in London, and behind me is the house where William Makepeace Thackeray lived for much of his adulthood, and I believe indeed died. He certainly died in Kensington, although the plaque says that he wasn't here the year of his death, but I'm not so sure about that. So Thackeray was one of the most celebrated British novelists of the 19th century, and his work was widely read into the 20th century. There was a 1998 series of perhaps his most popular novel, Vanity Fair. Vanity Fair, of course, taking its name from Pilgrim's Progress, that work by John Bunyan of sort of Christian parables. So where people are just very concerned about social status and fashion and their estimation, the estimation others have of them. He created this character, Becky Sharp, and I think her surname is meant to express something about her persona, coming from a lower middle class family, a woman of thrusting ambition who's quick-witted, vivacious, beautiful, marries up, but not averse to coquetting with other men whilst she's wed. But enough about that. I don't want to recount the whole tale of it here. Set in the time of the Napoleonic Wars, so just when he was a toddler. So Thackeray was born in Calcutta, or as Kolkata as it now is, in 1811, and his father was secretary to the Board of Revenue of the Honourable East India Company. I know most people take the most grave exception to the use of the word honourable there, but it was part of the organisation's name. And his mother's family had been working for John Company as well. So they were well-to-do, but when he was an infant, his father died. So when he was 5, his mother sent him back to England, well, a country he'd never seen, sent him back by ship. I don't know why she didn't return. He was an only child, which was highly unusual at the time, and his mother was quite young, so perhaps she was hoping to make another match while she was there. So his ship stopped off in St. Helena in the South Atlantic, and the exiled French Emperor Napoleon was pointed out to him. Anyway, he completed his voyage to the British Isles. He was farmed out to various relatives, went to a number of schools in Chiswick and elsewhere, and finally Charterhouse. Charterhouse being one of the most notable schools in the United Kingdom. Now, I'm pretty sure that Charterhouse was still in London at that time, because it was founded quite close to St. Paul's Cathedral, as in there had been Carthusian monks in the Middle Ages. Obviously the dissolution of the monasteries, that was suppressed in the 1530s, and then a school was founded using the same buildings. But in the 19th century it moved out to Godalming in Surrey, so outside London to the southwest, where they have more extensive grounds and a purpose-built site. It become too big, it couldn't be accommodated on its old site. So there's some sort of plaque where the original Charterhouse school was, but I think he went to the original site, not the one in Godalming. I've got to check. So he didn't like Charterhouse one bit, and quipped that it ought to be called Slaughterhouse. He was not that scholarly, and he wasn't much use at games, despite growing to an enormous 6'3". That is very tall these days, but in the 19th century that was gigantic. And he was much more interested in eating than exercising, so he was a corpulent boy, had an ungainly gait, slightly bad eyesight, had to start wearing glasses fairly early. Well, I mean, in his 30s, not that early, and seemed to have poor gross motor skills. Anyway, so he left that. He'd been brought up an Anglican, and it was a Church of England school, so that was all right. Seemed to have had some of the anti-Catholic prejudice, which was quite prevalent at the time. So he was stricken by illness in his last year at school. Then he went on to Cambridge University. He went to Trinity College, which then as now was regarded as perhaps the grandest college in the university. And it says something that he had little difficulty getting in, even though he wasn't that academic. He obviously wasn't a dimwit, but education was all about Latin and Greek. And if you weren't good at classics, you just weren't clever. Even if you're brilliant at modern languages, even if you're fantastic at science, even if you're outstanding at maths or something, nope, it's classics. That was really the queen of the subjects. Anyhow, so he only spent a year at Cambridge, and he spent most of his time writing for various undergraduate magazines, such as The Gownsman. They used to wear gowns, as in town and gown. The university people against the people who happen to live in Cambridge and have no connection with the university. And one called The Snob. Now, when you matriculated at one of the two great English universities at the time, they'd enter your name in a book, and they'd say whether you were a nobleman or not, And if you weren't a nobleman, someone, a commoner like me, they'd write sine nobilitate, Latin for without nobility. And he was one of those. But sine nobilitate was then abbreviated to S nob. Ooh, look, the clock is striking noon. I wonder if that's where they had his funeral, because they said his funeral was in Kensington, and that's not a stone's throw from his house. We'll have a little walk around, have a look at the church as I'm talking. So, anyway, so he liked writing satirical pieces for those. So he got fed up with university and he came down from university. So he inherited a handsome sum of money when he was 18, but he wasted it all on wages and frittered it away on high living, thinking that he was really going to make his way in society. He travelled extensively. He went to Paris, he went to Germany, to Weimar, which was really the birthplace of the Romantic movement, certainly in Germany, if not the whole of Europe. And he was graciously pleased to be granted an audience with Goethe, the very celebrated German novelist. His novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther, published, I think it was just before the French Revolution, was a smash hit. It was a sensation not only in the original German, but also in its English and French translations, such as the Napoleon said that this was the finest novel ever penned. So he was delighted to get to meet him. But really nothing was happening. He squandered his money on unwise investments. It was in 2 Indian banks, both of which failed. He tried to invest in a couple of magazines, and those both failed, because this country was starting to have a voracious appetite for newsprint, because it was moving towards full literacy. Obviously, it wasn't until 1870, after he died, that everybody got to go to school. But the middle classes were reading more and more and trying to better themselves. It was sort of Victorian self-improvement. This is the plaque on his house. It's not a blue plaque. It suggests that he lived it till the year before he died. I don't know if that's right or not. And you can see there's no door there anymore. It's been amalgamated into the neighbouring house. So, a blink and you'll miss it. So it's a very fine square, and this was built during his lifetime, because London was just expanding to this bit of Chelsea and Kensington. He died after the Great Exhibition, and some of this would have been farmland until the 1850s. So back to him. So then he got a bit more serious when he got married at the age of 5 and 20 years. He had 3 daughters in quick succession, but so he had to provide for his wife and children, though one of his daughters died in infancy. Anyway, that's when he really started to make his name with novels as well, like Pendennis, The Luck of Barry Lyndon, which is a picaresque novel about an Irish soldier in those wars, the mid-18th centuries, that War of Spanish Succession, 7 Years' War, things like that, made into a film by Stanley Kubrick in the 1970s. But Barry Lyndon is an Irish character, a sympathetic but rather roguish one, perhaps a bit like Becky Sharp. So maybe that's what he aspired to be himself. And then Vanity Fair, as I say, is the one that really made him his name and made him plenty of money. Look what he was able to afford. Because think, if we had no cinema, no internet, you'd spend an awful lot more time reading and an awful lot more money on books. And that's why these things could really be the talk of the town. And so he was very in demand as a journalist. He was witty and waspish, and he loved to be bitchy. So he had a sharp mind and an even sharper tongue. And was taking aim at the upper classes whom he aspired to join. He'd read law briefly at the bar, but he dropped out. He didn't bother being called to the bar. And then after his wife gave birth to their 3rd child, she suffered a postpartum depression. At first, he didn't appreciate the seriousness of the problem, but he found himself having to care for her melancholia so much he could scarcely put pen to paper, which is why he was going away so much, so that he could find artistic inspiration, just not be distracted by her mood swings and mania. But eventually he realised the situation was so grave he had to intervene. He thought a holiday to Ireland would be just the tonic, so they crossed the sea, and whilst on the ship, his wife jumped off the ship in a suicide bid while she was fished out of the brine. But her mental health didn't improve very much. Now, his trip to Ireland did not endear us to him, unfortunately. He returned to Great Britain. Eventually she had to be put into a psychiatric hospital. She ended up in France, if I remember rightly. She actually lived on another 54 years from this attack of mental illness, but she never recovered her reason. Anyway, so then he was writing for Punch magazine and various other satirical magazines, and Vanity Fair was founded as a magazine at this time, sometime after his novel was published. It's mainly an American magazine now. Then the famine broke out in Ireland in 1846, and it was the Conservative government gave way to well, the Whigs really, and the Peelites. He later declared himself up to be a Liberal, and he'd stood for Parliament as a Liberal in Oxford, but lost to Cardwell of the Army Reforms. But he really had no compassion for us, despite our suffering, and published all these pieces mocking us in our hour of need. Now, I'm definitely one for gallows humor and all the rest of it, but they say don't hit a man when he's down. And he wrote these scathing accounts of how wicked we are, and we'd all brought it on ourselves, it was our own fault. Okay, I mean, that could occasionally be true. Perhaps some people were foolish, or some people were bad at farming. We didn't deserve to starve to death, and it's not all of us, and the government could do more. And the idea was that property was to pay for it. Poverty was a local issue. There's a workhouse in each parish by the parish rates. But if famine has stricken a parish so badly that there's really just no money left to pay, and it was obviously the most poverty-stricken areas were the ones that suffering from it. They were already poor, and that was made even worse when the potato crop failed, and we had more or less a monoculture in some places along the Atlantic seaboard, because the soil was thin and stony and rather infertile, because we were lashed by the Atlantic salt gales. So not much could be grown. It wasn't sheltered by so many hills or woods to keep away the wind. I suppose there was sheep. What else could we do? Eat seaweed? I know it works for the Japanese, it worked for us. Fishing, you've got to have some good nets, and those will be gone. People reduced to eating slugs and snails, all the berries and fruits gone. Anyway, so like at least 800,000 people died as a result of the famine in the late 1840s, 1847 being the worst year, Black 47, and nary a whit of compassion escaped him for us. And he, by the way, was prone to gross feeding, which is why he had this gargantuan girth by the end of his life, and he was plagued by poor health on account of his own egregious gluttony. So that was him, a well-known figure in here and abroad. He twice toured the United States, gave readings, began to write some historical works, and was widely appreciated as a lecturer. So he died of a stroke at the age of 52. As we'd say in Ireland, one morning he woke up dead. I'm not sure if his funeral was conducted right there, that makes sense, but it was in Kensington, and 7,000 people filed past the catafalque. I'm not sure if he could quite lay in state, and his cortege set off to Kensal Green Cemetery. That's a graveyard that lies about 5 miles north of here. It had been opened not long before. It was the place to be seen dead in. It was the most fashionable place to have your grave, and still open. Anyway, his memorial sculpture was by Marocchetti, who was his next door neighbour but one, this famous Italian artist who lived right there. And they were there at the same time, obviously. All right, so that is enough about William Makepeace Thackeray. Makepeace, an exceptional middle name, never knew anyone else with that name. And the other thing I should point out about him is yes, there was Bal Thackeray in Mumbai, leader of the Shiv Sena political party, who died in 2011. I sometimes wonder whether they were related somehow, but I'm virtually certain they weren't. That's enough for me, so follow me on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook. Check out my new poetry channel, British Poesy, where I do nothing but read poetry and comment thereupon. Choose online lessons with me in English literature, English as a foreign language, history, politics, religious studies, geography, law, and French. And choose me as your tour guide in London when tourism reopens in about a millennium. Toodle pip.